Putin's war machine faces perhaps the gravest test of this 4-year war. Tanks sit stranded on the roads with empty fuel tanks, convoys burn, and along that vast war corridor stretching from Donbass to Crimea, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers are trapped, slowly resigning themselves to defeat. On paper, Russia's war machine looked unstoppable, even against Ukraine and the entire West behind it. Putin had staked this war on overwhelming numbers and inexhaustible resources. His plan was to grind Ukraine down by sheer force. Per Ukraine's commander-in-chief Syrskyi, there are 721,300 Russian troops at the front, and the reinforcements never stop. The Kremlin aims to expand the force to 800,000, keeping the manpower flowing through massive bonuses, prison programs, and foreign recruits. Limitless men, limitless oil, limitless time. That was Putin's entire bet. Yet beneath this colossal mass, a crisis was deepening, a military fuel and logistics crisis. And it cut so deep that the unthinkable happened. On June 28th, Putin conceded weakness in public for the first time in 4 years.
And queues, unfortunately, are still present at gas stations. The required grade of gasoline is not always available at the moment.
By stating that he could not supply his ground and air forces with enough fuel to power their war machine, Putin was, in reality, admitting to a strategic defeat. So what forced him to it? The numbers tell the story. Per Ukraine, on a single southern artery, more than 500 Russian vehicles are knocked out on some days. And almost every day, a refinery or energy facility goes up in flames. Plants that process millions of barrels of crude, producing the diesel for the tanks and the fuel for the jets. These were the main arteries feeding Putin's war machine, and Ukraine's strikes have become impossible to stop. A dictator does not concede a crisis that is genuinely under control. So the real question isn't whether Russia has a fuel problem, it's how Ukraine managed to lay siege to the army of one of the world's largest oil producers. So far behind in numbers, Ukraine built this siege on a single idea, one of the oldest lessons of war. Sun Tzu wrote 2,000 years ago, "An army that loses its supply is lost." They say professionals talk logistics. Rather than meeting force with force, Ukraine chose the indirect approach, striking not the army, but what feeds the army. Hunting a single tank is costly and slow, but hit the convoy carrying that tank's fuel, the bridge it crosses, the refinery that produces it, and you halt not one vehicle, but an entire unit at once. And Russia's vastness is precisely what makes it vulnerable. Feeding an army this large means pushing an estimated 15 million liters of fuel forward each day, and that flow can move along a handful of fixed arteries, the R280 highway in the south, the Bryansk, Kursk, and Rostov rail lines in the north and east. By the logic the insider underscores, the farther a logistics hub sits from the front, the more cargo piles up on it, and the larger the area Russia must defend. A vehicle knocked out near the front line means roughly 40 liters of fuel. A fuel train or depot deep in the rear means tons. So every strike that reaches deeper destroys more. Two things remained, the right moment and the right weapon. Ukraine waited for both. Per its unmanned systems forces, intermediate-range strike missions have risen 28-fold over the past year. More than 14 different drone types have created a kill zone reaching 300 kilometers behind the front. Cheap, swarming drones do the day-to-day strangling. Western-supplied long-range missiles like the Storm Shadow are held back for the hardest, deepest targets, the refineries. With one systematic move, Ukraine seized fire control of the arteries, burned the fuel before it reached the front, and struck the refinery at the source. Putin trusted the size of his geography. Ukraine turned that size into open ground where every kilometer can be hit. The noose is tightest in the south. The Dnieper group, holding the front from Crimea up to left bank Kherson and Zaporizhia, depends on the war's most exposed supply corridor, the R280 Novorossiya highway, the only unbroken land artery running from Rostov-on-Don through occupied Mariupol, Berdyansk and Melitopol into Crimea. This group has no rail alternative either. The Kerch Bridge is closed to trucks, leaving everything to this road and the ferries, a single point of failure. Moscow has poured roughly $12 billion into this corridor since 2024. Ukraine has turned it into what the insider calls a logistics lockdown, a road of death. The numbers bear it out. Per Unmanned Systems Forces Commander Madhyar, military cargo traffic on the R280 fell 71% in 2 weeks, from 3,800 trucks a day to 1,100. Independent counts are more cautious but confirm the direction. Per OSINT analyst Clément Mollin, more than 500 vehicle strikes were geolocated between 1st of May and 20th of June, 90 of them in 19th to 21st of June alone. By Ukraine's General Staff's broader count, Russia lost roughly 7,000 vehicles in May alone, 5 times the war's monthly average. The Berdyansk junction has become the war's most heavily targeted choke point. The Melitopol-Crimea road is littered with burned-out trucks and tankers. And the result shows on the ground. A Russian airborne regiment on the Kinburn Spit had to abandon its positions once fuel, ammunition and food were cut off. Ukraine's Southern Operational Group confirmed the withdrawal. Toward Huliai-Pole, per a Ukrainian regiment commander, Russian ammunition and drone deliveries collapsed, reconnaissance drones dropped by 2/3, and the infantry had to carry artillery rounds on their backs. The most mechanized army of 2026, once its supply is cut, regresses to the tempo of the First World War. The highway is only one edge. The true backbone of Russian military logistics is the railway, and that is no longer safe either. By Tochny's count, 28 locomotives and freight trains were hit across occupied territory and the border belt from March through the end of May. 5 of them inside Russia's own border regions, 3 in Bryansk, 2 in Kursk. The rest are spread across the occupied map, 8 in Crimea, 11 in occupied Luhansk, 6 in Donetsk, 5 in Zaporizhia. In May, rail traffic between Donetsk and Yasinuvata halted entirely for a stretch, disrupting the Debaltseve, Ilovaisk and Mariupol routes. Per CNN, the number of trains targeted since January has passed 20, most of them fuel trains. The strain reached a point where the occupation administration shut 2 main highways from Belgorod and Rostov-on-Don to military traffic altogether. Entry into Crimea is closing off entirely. The Kerch Bridge has been shut to trucks since 2022, leaving fuel dependent on ferries. Yet in recent weeks, the Kerch oil depot, a thermal power plant, and the Kavkaz ferry terminal were set ablaze, and even a ferry carrying equipment from Krasnodar was struck. The rail entries are falling too. Per reports, the rail bridge over the North Crimean Canal was destroyed on the night of 21st June, after the Chonhar Bridge had already collapsed. Per ISW, Ukraine has temporarily disabled every land route between occupied Kherson and Crimea. Every artery feeding the peninsula, road, rail, ferry, sits in the same vice. Ukraine isn't cutting the artery only on the road, it's drying it up at the source. Per Reuters, the strikes have knocked out roughly a quarter of Russia's gasoline production capacity, and refining volumes have fallen to a 21-year low. Ukrainian and OSINT assessments push that loss as high as 40% on some days. The Moscow refinery, which supplies 40% of the capital's fuel, was hit several times in June. Per Reuters again, repairs will take at least 6 months, and the plant may not return within the year. And these strikes land hundreds of kilometers inside. Ukraine's drones and Western-made cruise missiles have brought even refineries deep in Russia's interior within range. And the links keep multiplying. Per reports and satellite imagery, Orenburg, one of Russia's largest gas processing complexes, was damaged, and a major fire broke out at the Slavyansk-na-Kuban refinery in Krasnodar. The damage even spills across the border. When Tatarstan's huge Tenneco plant went down, a Kazakh refinery that drew its feedstock from it was hit too. A single Ukrainian strike, rattling even Russia's suppliers. The strain spread from the front to the country at large. More than 50 regions imposed gasoline restrictions. In some places, stations were patrolled, and the Kremlin-backed administration in Crimea declared a state of emergency on June 26th and halted civilian gasoline sales. The worst energy crisis on the peninsula since annexation. The wave even reached tourism. Per reports, hotel bookings in occupied Crimea fell by a third, with cancellation rates reaching 80% at some venues. So what happens at the front once the source dries up and the roads are cut? The hardest hit are tanks, armor, and supply convoys, the war's most fuel-dependent pieces. The same vehicle that hauls fuel also carries ammunition, drone batteries, and food. When the convoy doesn't arrive, it isn't only the tanks that stop, the whole unit goes dark. And a unit gone dark doesn't stop fighting, but the way it fights changes, to Russia's disadvantage. The fuel crisis forces the army from armored maneuver toward infantry-heavy tactics, and the assaults shrink, growing predictable and dependent on manpower. Per ISW, in the first 3 weeks of June, the intensity of Russian attacks rose while their scale shrank, unplanned, uncoordinated, costly in casualties. By the same assessment, between the 1st and the 22nd of June, Russia suffered more than 1,000 troops lost in a single day for the first time since March 2025. By Army Inform's figures, the value of equipment lost on some days exceeds $300 million. The paradox sits right here. Russia attacks more with fewer resources, and its losses compound. Nor is this a new weakness. In the 2022 Kiev offensive, tanks ran dry by the roadside, 60-kilometer convoy columns formed, and the assault stalled in a logistics collapse. The same pattern is at work across a far wider geography. Some units are desperate enough to paint their trucks and disguise them as civilian vehicles to save fuel. This logistics crisis is no abstract picture. You can read it in how Russia fights in each sector. The starkest example is Pokrovsk. Russia took this strategic city and Myrnorad in early 2026 after a months-long siege, yet it has been unable to advance since. There has been no meaningful progress west of the city since December 2025. The shared verdict of independent assessments is this: Russia can still attack, but it cannot convert the ground it gains into an operational breakthrough. And the reason is, in part, that the fuel and supply to feed such a breakthrough no longer flow. The main weight has shifted east to the Kramatorsk-Kostiantynivka defensive belt. Many analysts regard this as the principal front of the Russian offensive. Yet here too, Russia advances not with armored mass, there's no fuel to feed it, but by the Pokrovsk method: infiltration with small infantry groups and systematic targeting of Ukraine's supply routes. Even as Deep State calls the city's fall a matter of time, the fortifications built over more than a decade still hold. Toward Lyman in the north, Ukraine holds the eastern part. Russian units can only infiltrate in small groups across difficult terrain and, in ISW's words, are pushed into unplanned, hurried assaults before the fuel tightens further. In the south, along the Huliai-Pole and Zaporizhia line, the fighting is intense, but the pattern is the same. Russia can't mass for a frontal assault and settles for small group probes, the clearest sign of the fuel crisis turning armor into infantry. This is the very sector where ammunition is carried on backs. In the north, toward Kharkiv and Vovchansk, Russia presses to stretch Ukraine's defenses, but with its own air defense pulled back to shield Moscow, sustaining that pressure grows steadily harder. In Ukraine's General Staff's 22nd June tally, most of the day's 251 clashes concentrated on a few axes: 44 at Pokrovsk, 24 at Huliai-Pole, 20 at Kostiantynivka. Russia also presses toward Kupiansk and Sumy, but straining a front this wide all at once is becoming impossible on dwindling fuel. The same reality everywhere: Russia attacks more and gains less, since the machine behind it is strained to its last drop. By ISW's mapping, Russia is even losing net territory in some weeks. We've seen the picture that forced Putin into that confession, but the crack behind it runs far deeper than his words. Putin brushed it off as a temporary deficit, insisting, "The damaged facilities are being repaired quickly, the problems aren't critical." Yet the crack isn't only in his mouth. Pro-war Russian mill bloggers openly criticize Gerasimov, saying, "There's no offensive without fuel." Some Z channels are panicked enough to write that, "There's nothing at the stations, the country is in catastrophe." Per the FT and Novaya Gazeta Europe, Putin is increasingly misinformed about the battlefield reality. As the briefings are filtered, what the Kremlin sees and what's happening at the front drift apart. Even Russia's central bank is blunter. The fuel sector running below full capacity for months will take a bite out of this year's growth. The most concrete opening for Ukraine is Russia's need to defend everywhere at once. The front waits for fuel, but that same fuel is needed at Moscow's filling stations. To protect a refinery, air defense is pulled from the front. Per Zelensky, hundreds of S-400 and Pantsir launchers were shifted to Moscow. Yet the front needs that air defense too. The convoy wants an escort, but an escort can't fight at the front. Every protective decision leaves somewhere else exposed, and Ukraine strikes precisely that gap. The loop feeds itself. Still, it would be a mistake to take Russia for a sitting duck, and that's where the real tension lies. Moscow remains one of the world's largest oil producers. Military fuel is prioritized over civilian, and some still reaches the front, even amid shortage. The country adapted under the 2022 sanctions too, and it is taking steps. It has raised imports from Belarus, asked Kazakhstan for 50,000 tons of gasoline, is bringing fuel by sea from Asia for the first time in its history, has allowed refineries to produce lower quality fuel, and banned gasoline exports through July 31st. Yet every remedy carries its own weakness, and that tightens the noose rather than loosening it. Crude oil isn't fuel. A significant share of the refineries to process it are out of action. Military fuel comes first, but the queues in more than 20 regions breed domestic strain. One governor likened the scene to the panic buying during the pandemic. Imports lack the volume to close the gap. On top of that, per Reuters, Kazakhstan said it had received no formal request, and its own refinery is going into maintenance. Lower quality fuel wears engines down faster, military vehicles included, and the export ban cuts state revenue. Russia is putting out the fire, but the water it's using is running out too. Putin can plan to expand the army to 800,000, can declare the crisis temporary. But the artery keeping 721,000 soldiers alive is stretched along a front of more than 1,000 kilometers, and every knot of it is under fire. Ukraine is doing this not with one great battle, but with patience, severing a map of arteries, one node at a time. What breaks an army isn't always a defeat at the front. Sometimes it's a refinery running dry at the source, or a tank column whose tanks never fill. One question remains: if this artery keeps being squeezed at every point at once, how much longer can Putin call it under control? We're grateful that you've chosen GT Global. If you enjoy geopolitics and analyses like these, which you won't easily find in mainstream media, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support us. See you in the next video.